Welcome to Broadcast Astrology, Insight for Humans.
This is Lisa Pesnicek.
And I'm Sara Beckner, and we're here to deep dive into the fascinating world of astrology.
We offer blind chart readings, interviews with notable guests, and much more.
So keep listening as we bring you Insight for Humans.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Broadcast Astrology, Insight for Humans. We're so excited to be here today to usher you into the world of astrology and myth. We're going to have very insightful conversation. We have Rachelle Hicks here, an old astrology friend of Sara and myself from Astrology University. All three of us completed the 4-year program. And she's really kind of branched out and created a mythological orientation to the consultation work that she does. But nobody can describe it better than Rachelle herself. So welcome, Rachelle. So nice to have you here today.
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa and Sara, for having me. And yes, so my name is Rachelle Hicks. My name looks like it's spelled like Rochelle, but it is Rachel. I can confirm. And I actually, as an astrologer, I still feel like a bit of a baby astrologer. I only really started studying very seriously in 2019. But I mean, it felt like it just came into my world like a hurricane and it just hasn't left. So it felt like it came in really quick and I started just working with it right away. I've just been in love with it ever since. So I was getting little taps from about 2015 to 2019. I was having a few people say, hey, you seem like you understand this astrological language. I was dabbling in it ever so slightly, like hardly at all. And I'd be like, that's crazy. I would never call myself an astrologer. Like, what? That's way too woo-woo. I was already a yoga teacher at that time. So anyway, by 2019, I was like, okay, I'm going to commit to this more. And I found the 4-year program at Astrology University. I signed up for it and it just took off from there. And what I realized, which a lot of people, I think, start to realize with astrology, is that it's actually not very woo-woo at all. It's quite practical application. Like, I'm amazed by some of the tools and practicality that you can do, or that astrology can be used for. There's, of course, self-reflection and being able to understand yourself from a psychological perspective. But then even just the timing work and being able to prepare or even just energetically prepare yourself for certain things that are to come. So yeah, I do consultation work with people. I work one-to-one with people. And as Lisa mentioned, I work a lot with myth. So myth is heavily woven into my practice. And that was something that organically formed. And I've just really found a lot of benefit in adding myth to the technical side of astrology. I often will say that astrology is like learning a new language, where myth is like learning poetry. And it's just such a beautiful way to go deeper with the language and to see it in a more symbolic or abstract way. So at the moment, again, I do one-to-one consultations, and I also have a weekly astrology column for a very well-known paper here in Ireland. It's called the Irish Independent. I was blown away when they contacted me. I was like, this is so mainstream, and they want a weekly astrology column. I was like, that is such a sign of the times. And I write a blog for Astrology University as well. So yeah, that's about what I'm doing. But, things are still unfolding. As I said, I've only been professionally working with astrology since 2019. And in the world of astrology, I feel like that's actually quite a short time. But it's still branching out and it just feels very active in my life.
That makes me want to look at your chart, Rachelle. That opportunity fell upon
You're
you.
welcome to. I have no problem with that.
Yeah, that's very exciting. And I really
Yeah.
appreciate you saying something about astrology not being the woo, because not being the woo-woo. Because for those of us on this side of the curtain, we know that the study and the practice of astrology is actually quite rigorous. And it's just interesting that sometimes I forget that the outside perception is still, it's considered kind of fluffy, soft science. But for those of us studying it, it really is quite academically rigorous. It has a lot of historical context. And it is very practical and can help us navigate all of the real life things. So today, I have been so looking forward to this conversation about myth because I don't use it a lot in my own practice, but I'm so intrigued by it because I really see the value as well. First of all, it just adds a lot of depth to the astrology. And I think that's because it sort of pulls us out of our cultural storyline, our cultural narrative of the day, and ties us in with the part of us that is most human and most universal and transcends the ages. So I know these stories are powerful, but I don't really know quite how to work with them yet with regard to a client's chart. So if you want to open up there today and just tell us, are you pulling the myths, the stories from the symbolism of the astrological chart? Are you pulling it because you're hearing these stories through the client's own words as they describe their lived experiences or the questions that they're coming to you with? So how do you connect the stories to the client?
Mm.
How do you share it? And yeah, just give us a sense of how you're incorporating it in your own practice.
Yeah, so when I first started learning a bit of myth, it was woven into the 4-year program at Astrology University. There's a few courses, especially with Saffron Rossi and Jason Hawley. The ones that they taught had a lot of myth involved. And even Demetra George, she has her book, The Asteroid Goddesses. And there's a lot of mythology actually when you're looking at asteroids, because a lot of them have the names of these characters. And so when I first started hearing these myths, I just loved it. I have always loved stories. That's been the case for my whole life. When I was younger, I was a writer and I loved writing stories. I am a very imaginative person, and like fantasy and sci-fi and all that have always really intrigued me. And it's always been really easy for me to see something that is fantasy and find meaning of it in day-to-day life, or a relevant sin, or something to remember that can be applied. And so for me, myth was just sort of a logical transition. But I was very overwhelmed. I was like, there are so many characters and so many stories, and they interlap. And some of the stories are totally different depending on who's telling it. Like, how will this ever be applicable? So what I started to do was I love the notes app on my computer. I use my notes app probably the most out of anything. And I started to create a folder, and I would write like Aries. These are some of the myths that I would associate with Aries. And characters. There's some that are really obvious. Of course, the god of war, Aries, can be associated with Aries and some of his stories. Of course, the god Mercury has many stories connected to the planet Mercury, but then also the signs of Gemini and Virgo. And so I just started to catalog them for myself. And sometimes it wouldn't even be a whole story. It would be like a scene, or just the characteristics of a character. And so I started to keep that log. And then when I would be preparing for someone's reading, of course, we know as astrologers that every chart will have VIP planets and signs. Not every sign and not every planet is going to have the same importance. So as I was reflecting on that, I'd be like, oh, this person has a really strong Mercury. I wonder if this story about Mercury would be interesting for them. And it didn't have to be necessarily their natal chart. It could be a transit. So for example, someone having a Pluto transit, there are so many stories about underworld journeys. Oh my goodness. So many amazing underworld journey stories. And they're so evocative for someone going through a Pluto transit time. So yeah, it started off as me cataloging it. And I did feel this, because we would be exposed to teachers who would have so much experience with myth. I did feel very overwhelmed by like, should I know everything about myth before I start working with it? And I started to realize that it's okay to just have a small collection of go-tos, have a few stories or a few symbols for Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto if you're looking at transits, have a few go-tos with the signs and the planets when you're working with a natal chart. And you don't have to have a large collection, just ones that really speak to you. And you can start to weave it in. I would find that I would write off to the side when I was preparing for a consultation, just a few go-to ones, and I would feel it out. Like, some people do not like myth. And I learned that the hard way. I would bring something in and they'd be like, how is this relevant? But for a lot of people, some people like absolutely love it. It just really lights them up and it makes them experience their chart in a totally different way. So I started to learn how to read people as well. I started to learn how to understand, okay, is this person going to take to this kind of symbolism, or do we need to stay with a linear path here? Yeah, and then after a little while, I just started to be able to hear it a bit more in real time in the consultations. And then I started to be able to pull from different myths that were in my mind and bring them in real time.
Beautiful. So I guess the next step might be, because you provided us a couple example charts
Hmm.
for some of the clients who you've worked with or people in your life. And I guess maybe to set what you're saying into motion and give it form and more life to it. Would you want to start looking at some of those charts?
Of course, yeah, and
Okay.
we can talk more about how myth is relevant and use some of these chart examples as well.
Well,
Okay.
I'm wondering, yeah, while you pull up the chart, the first chart, Lisa, one of the questions that came to my mind as you're talking, Rachel, is can myth help with predictive work? Like, if you really become familiar with these stories, does it give you a sense if you see a strong myth at work in somebody's life or they're in this story, does it give you a sense of where the story's going or the outcome of the story? Or if somebody's going through a Plutonian period, can you pull on those myths to give them a sense of not only what that terrain looks like, but what the outcome? Every story, there's the moral to the story. And I think about the hero's journey and the arc of the hero's journey. Is that embedded in these myths in a way that helps you see what will come of somebody's situation?
I think with the myths, it gives you this option set, kind of a narrative demonstrating the different options that may happen. And with some myths, there's a lesson. And some myths are just, they're so wild and out there. There's not really a moral lesson to it, but some of them there are. I think with the underworld journey myths, it's that question of, will you take this journey? And what are the consequences of not taking that journey? Most of the time we see someone taking the journey, but it's really hard. They get stripped of their ego. They get stripped of a lot of parts of identity. And not many of the myths do we see them not taking that underworld journey. But I think that's what Pluto is asking. Like, hey, can you step up to this in whatever way that will show up in your life? And I don't necessarily I think that the myth wouldn't actually lend itself to like how this may turn out, but it gives you options to, if you choose this path, this may be what manifests. These would be maybe the potential benefits. These are the cautionary parts of it. I often think of the Uranus. So the Furies are connected to Uranus. I think that this was written about in Richard Tarnas's book. I'm pretty sure The Gods of Change. And he talks about the Furies in relation to Uranus. And one of the things he'll say is that when you're experiencing a Uranus energy, there's that desire for liberation. It's like a lightning bolt kind of energy. And so if you are allowing yourself to take on that spark and to change, then sometimes other people in your life may not like that change. And so it can bring out the Furies in them. They will be furious with you, potentially. But if you feel that Uranian urge and you deny that in yourself, then that can lead to resentment and basically like bringing out the Furies through you. So I love that idea for a Uranus transit because you're faced with, okay, where are the Furies going to come out here? Do I have to be okay with upsetting some people, or do I harbor this and then the Furies come out through me, which could be actually detrimental to my physical health? So I think it helps you with options.
So what about Neptune?
Yes.
The thing that comes to my mind is the sirens, but I don't know if there's another go-to for Neptune that you would pull in.
Oh my gosh, of course. Yeah. Well, the sirens are fantastic. But one of the things that I'll often refer to with the sirens is that the sirens is actually, it's a deadly song. Anyone who gets called into the sirens territory, they meet their death. They don't survive it. But at the same time, maybe there's some wisdom in that sound. And is it possible for us to, like, the scene would be Odysseus on his journey back home. He has to strap himself to the mast and hear the song, but not physically be pulled in. And during those Neptune times, we might be pulled into this fantasy, into nostalgia, into what could be, idealizing this other life that could totally wreck your real life. Can you hear that song and be inspired by while not physically being drawn into the water? Yeah, I think it poses these questions.
Beautiful. Well, and appropriately, this chart that we brought up here has Neptune rising.
Yes.
So I don't know if this individual that would be applicable for in some ways, but there's also a lot of other things going on. Do you want to pull us in to Tommy's chart here?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share. This is actually my partner's chart. So this is Tommy. He's my partner. I've been able to have lots of conversations with him about mythology and his chart. And he does have obviously I'm biased, but I do find his chart pretty intriguing. He does have some really interesting connections here, especially with all the air and the fire and Pluto on the MC, Neptune on the ascendant. There's some really specific archetypes, I think. Like, he is a communicator 100%. And so that really is obvious in all the air qualities. But so one of the things when we look at his chart, of course, he's an Aquarius sun sign, but his chart ruler, Jupiter, is also in Aquarius. And so I would, first of all, like if I was working with this chart for the first time, I would first of all think, okay, there's a lot of Aquarius energy in here. Not all Aquarians have that amount of Aquarian energy. And so one of the strongest myths for Aquarius is the myth of Prometheus. And Prometheus is the god who really did not like the hierarchical setup between the gods of Olympus and humankind. And so he wanted to equalize the playing field. So the famous story with Prometheus is that he saw this was a time when humans had no access to fire. And he thought that that was incredibly unfair. Only the gods of Olympus had the access to fire. And he was looking at the humans just fumbling around in the dark. And he was like, well, how are they ever going to do anything with this disadvantage? And so he asked Zeus, can we give fire to the humans? And they said, no, there's a hierarchy here. And so he said, well, I'm just going to steal it. So he stole fire and then gave it to the humans, and then humanity thrived. And he was eventually punished for this act. But this is a really strong narrative for the Aquarian archetype. And we even see it very strongly coming about with Pluto in Aquarius for the next 20 or so years. This sort of awareness of hierarchy and things that are not equal. And this is like a real sore spot for Aquarians, I feel, this Prometheus story. And he's very much in favor of the everyman, and he does not see one person being better than another person. It doesn't make any sense to him. So like the Prometheus story for sure, I think would resonate with the Aquarian energy for him.
Beautiful. I almost wonder if that Neptune just creates this compassion as well.
Mm.
And the Pluto on the MC giving some vision of things needing to be changed and needing to initiate long-term change, being inspired by that Promethean. And the thing that I find so interesting about Prometheus and Aquarius, as well as just the image of the water bearer, is that I think the thing that ties most of them together, as well as it being an air sign, is this idea of systems is often what I think about. Is it's a different kind of organization because it's from a traditional perspective, it's Saturn ruled, but in an air sign. So it's like bringing a logistical organization that's much more complex than the Capricornian Earth version. I just see all these lines in the air, this electrical webbing that is tying things together in a specific way. And that Prometheus pulling that string together and creating equality on some level is very interesting.
Mm. Oh, absolutely. And I also would use the traditional rulership. So I absolutely see the Saturn rulership with his
Mhm.
chart and the emphasis here in Aquarius. And it is fascinating because I do feel like the Neptune 100% softens a lot of what could be more punchy energy in his chart. He's exceptionally helpful with people. He works with people one to one in a therapeutic capacity.
Mhm.
And it's very soulful work that he does. That boundarylessness, especially in that kind of interface with other people, definitely shows up. But so there's one interesting thing that came up that honestly, it really only came up through conversation together. But I ended up looking at the asteroids, which I don't normally do. I usually pull on the myth just from the chart itself. But there was one conversation we had where he was working some things out with some dynamics with his mom. And his mom isn't around anymore, but there were some patterns with him and his mom from when he was younger that he was working out now. And I have full permission to share this, by the way. So he is totally fine with me sharing this. So she would have had some covert, inappropriate behavior with him. And he was the youngest child of 6. And the setup from a psychological perspective would be that she would have had him as a surrogate husband type of character in her life. Her actual husband wasn't really around very much. And so, him being the youngest child of 6, he kind of became an accessory to her. And so what was really interesting is he was working some things out just personally and reflecting on this dynamic and how it was showing up for him in this present day. And I just thought to myself, I was like, oh my gosh, this reminds me so much of the dynamic between the god Eros and his mother Venus. And I was like, that is so fascinating how it just brought that up for me. And then in the story, in the myth, Venus is the archetypal goddess of love, and Eros was her son. But he was like her accessory, and she would often get him to go off and do her dirty work. So Venus, was not always the sweet goddess of love. She had a dark side. I mean, she would
Some
often
manipulation in there.
absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And Eros has this famous love story with Psyche, the mortal Psyche. And
Mhm.
so it was really interesting. We just had this amazing conversation one day where I told him about this myth, and it just really struck him very deeply. And it gave him some insights to the dynamic he would have had with his mom. And what's so fascinating when we look at the chart, you can see that his moon, like it's a wider orb, but his moon is opposite Pluto.
Mhm.
And when I was looking up the asteroids, the asteroid Eros is exactly conjunct Venus in his chart as
Mm.
well. So, kind of speaking to that, the archetype of femininity or, dealing with the yin energy. So, if I was working with Tommy from a consultation point of view, if he was talking to me about that dynamic, then I would be like, oh, wow, that myth just showed up without me naturally going to it in the chart.
Yeah, he definitely has an interesting mother story just from the way that, yeah,
Moon
the
Chiron.
moon
The 4
Chiron.
times.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Awesome.
So what is that glyph next to the moon?
That's Eris.
Oh, that is Eris.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Oh,
threw that in
yeah.
there.
I
It's very
remember.
close.
Mhm. I remember actually. So Tommy's one of these people, he's a truth teller. He tells the truth as it is. And that's part of the work that he does with people. People don't want him to be around the bush. So, like, can you just tell me what I'm not seeing here? And he's
Mhm.
very good at doing that. And one of the things, though, it doesn't really happen anymore, but years ago, he had this dynamic where if we'd be at a social event, it'd be hard for him to know the boundary of when is it appropriate to tell the truth, when is it not, like a social context.
I think
And there
Pluto
was
on
one day.
Oh.
Sorry, what'd you say?
I think Pluto on any of the angles really does that.
Yeah. It's a heavy planet to maneuver when it's that influential. And also the moon is our memory, it's our emotional expression. And having the moon aligned with all of that, as well as Chiron, it just makes him sensitive to the need for the truth, I think. And Neptune on the ascendant, understanding, having that compassion, having that softness, having also the need to please. And that's something that I see as maybe part of the mother story here too, is there's something inside of him that feels a lot of compassion for other people because of what he's experienced potentially, which is beautiful. It's a beautiful gift. There's a real healing signature to this chart for sure.
I would say 100%. Like, I don't think he sees any other purpose in a day. He's like, well, this is the work we're doing here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Besides having dinner and then having a cuddle with me, it's like, okay, now we get to work. We help people.
Yeah, definitely. That's beautiful.
But the reason I remember now why we have Eris in there was because I was actually preparing a talk about the goddess Eris for a small group that I was working with. And I just happened to tell Tommy about Eris, who is the goddess of discord. And she had the habit of not being invited to parties because she would tell the truth. And she was like, oh, that's like me. And I said, well, let me just check where Eris is. And I was like, oh, it's exactly conjunct your moon. How very interesting.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Anything else we want to cover about this one? And in a synopsis, how would you say that Tommy understanding the mythological parts of this chart, how would you say that really illuminated things for him? I mean, I know that you've kind of touched on that, but just in a quick conclusion.
I think one of the interesting things with myth is it gives a little bit of objectivity, even though myth is very, it's like going into stories and it can be very abstract and very ethereal. But when he could hear these other characters having these stories that are similar to stories that he would have, it's like, oh, it's not just me. This is a deep code in humanity. And these are the stories that we sign up for. I have this idea that when we enter into this place that we sign up for these types of stories and these contracts. And it's like, okay, well, how do you want to play this out? It gives you a different sort of perspective.
Beautiful.
I would think it would give him, well, I mean, in addition to just being very validating, it could clarify the work, give him permission to steal the fire and know that sometimes there's going to be retribution or consequences in some way, or it's not going to be well received by everyone, but it's part of what he's doing, you know?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these Aquarius planets are in a square to Mars, indicating that sometimes he might not always have the greatest eloquence with how he perceives things, or things could sometimes get pushed back. But there's also this beautiful trine mutual reception with the Saturn, which I think balances that and gives it a solidity and more pragmatic approach. So, yeah, beautiful. All right. Are we ready to move to the next one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So the next individual who Rachel brought to us is a woman named Jan. And you want to bring us into this? It's another Sag rising.
Yeah. I'm also Sag rising, by the way. Yeah.
I love
That's one of the fun things with myth is that it's really funny. You'll see this with all astrology, but with myth, it's like, oh wow, I'm really noticing these recurring themes. And you start to see reflections of yourself as well, because you'll get ones that come up often.
Mhm.
So yeah, so Jan is someone I work with, and she is an herbalist and a naturopath. And of course, we can see she has a lot of Virgo energy. Her sun is in Virgo, and her MC ruler is in Virgo, as well as her sixth house ruler being in Virgo, which is Venus. And so, what I find really interesting is that there's a lot of keywords and phrases that people will use for Virgo. The discerning one, the editor of the zodiac. It's harder language, I would say, that kind of critical side of Virgo. And one of the myths that I love to work with for Virgo is the goddess Demeter, who is the nature goddess. And it just fits so perfectly for Jan because Jan does work with herbs and nature and the earth. And she's not the only Virgo that I have met who works with actual plants or how plants can be useful, another Virgo quality. And I think even just having this very soft, feminine figure like Demeter is really interesting for someone who may have heard a lot of other Virgo qualities that sound harder. And yeah, so that one, I think she found very refreshing, this concept of Demeter as this nature goddess, and it really fit in with her work. And in addition to that, this is where we start to see that kind of rule with astrology that if something is going to be true, you'll probably see it represented multiple times in the chart. And so, of course, we see that she has Sag rising and the moon in Sag. And I would also associate Chiron with Sagittarius,
Mhm.
and just because of that centaur connection. But very interestingly, with Chiron's mythology, he was actually known as being the first herbalist and naturopath on Mount Pelion. So that's just a really interesting connection where we see her work highlighted so strongly with that Sagittarius Virgo dynamic. And I think the biggest thing for her was just to see, I think from her perspective, a softer, more natural quality rather than that harsh critic that Virgo is often known for.
Yeah. I really appreciate that bringing Demeter and Chiron in. And there is in this chart also an element of service and sacrifice and finding meaning possibly through the healing arts for her. Also with her Jupiter in the 12th house conjunct Neptune indicates, I'm here for service. I'm not here to be showy. I'm not here to be overly harsh or critical. I'm here with a compassionate hand to work behind the scenes and help you to heal and find happiness and health. And also, I think the moon in the first house reiterates that too.
So
Mm.
look how close that connection is between Eris and the IC.
I know, I know. And
Wow.
Chiron's right there too.
Mm. Well, I hadn't looked up Eris and her chart before, so that's my first time seeing it.
Some sort of family ancestral story there,
Mm.
which is really powerful.
Mm. And again, so I don't work a lot with Chiron. Like I don't always have it in every chart that I pull up. And so I again didn't know that Chiron was so close to her IC. And that's just another sort of indicator of bringing in Chiron. Um, this is kind of like as an astrologer preparing for a session, this is how I would work with it. I would see if certain characters continue to show up in different ways. And I'll
Mhm.
be like, okay, so you're starting to speak more loudly. You probably are going to be relevant in some way.
Yeah, it's that classic, you see it once, you think about it, you see it twice maybe, and then you see it the third time and it's true.
Yeah.
I think it's so crazy that the first two charts you bring I mean, there's some interesting parallels between these charts.
For sure. And so clearly Jan found some ways of understanding herself in her Virgo placements. And I think Virgo sometimes does kind of get a bad rap for being the perfectionist and all of those things. And all the signs have the box that they get stuck in. But I love how the Demeter archetype of bringing life to the land can help to widen and soften the ways that Virgo can be seen so rigidly. So is that kind of what she found?
Oh, absolutely. And even that nurturing quality of Demeter, she has a famous story with her and her daughter, Persephone, which is a whole other
Mhm.
thing where myths
Yeah.
start to get very complex, where it's like, okay, one story leads into another story. But she was very nurturing and very caring, is not something we would always just say outright about Virgo, kind of like pop astrology. So I think tapping into her energy was a very beautiful experience for her.
Gorgeous. All right. Then our third one we have is Claire. Do you want to pull us into this one?
Yeah, so Claire is another friend and someone that I have worked with. And it is interesting. I do end up working with a lot of people with Pluto connections. And I also have Pluto conjunct my MC. So I guess that's kind of a synchronicity that shows up there. I often will talk about underworld journeys with people in relation to their natal chart. So that's something that I will get frequently. But Claire has Pluto on her ascendant here. And yeah, this was actually something that very deeply resonated with her because if we look at some of the other characteristics of her chart, she's got Sun in Aries, Moon in Gemini, um, her chart ruler Venus in Gemini. She's a very playful person and she definitely comes across that way. But she does have this incredible depth and this ability to go where other people would shy away from. And yeah, so she's a special needs instructor for adults with special needs. And she's also training to be a spelling to communicate practitioner. And she's got this such soulful quality about her, even though she's also got this exceptional vibrancy and playfulness. And so when I first worked with her, we talked about some underworld journeys, a few of the classic underworld journeys. Like the two that I think we spoke about were the myth of Psyche and Eros. So going back to the Eros myth, but this is actually more so featuring his lover, Psyche's journey. She goes on a heroine's journey into the underworld and then back again. And another famous underworld story is the story of Persephone, where she kind of goes from being this innocent maiden and there's a few different versions of why she goes into the underworld. I like to think that she goes by choice. I think it's kind of a more modern way of seeing it. But anyway, once Persephone goes into the underworld, she is transformed from this innocence into a wise woman, and she ultimately becomes queen of the underworld. So we get to see these heroine journeys, I think. And Claire really resonated with this, like in the work that she does. And she said to me that when we spoke about the myths, it was more like it brought it more to the surface for her, like that kind of power to take her work where other people may not want to go. So, yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, I was just thinking about another way to look at Pluto. Lisa and I did a deep dive into medical astrology. And
Mhm.
one of the, for Pluto in medical astrology is abnormalities. So if you see Pluto with Jupiter, it could be abnormal growth. It can be developmental abnormalities. If you see it tied into the home, it can be abnormalities in the family systems and growing up. And I'm just wondering if there's a parallel, if Pluto shows up in any of these myths as things that are abnormal, exaggerated, or, and I was just wondering about this with her because she has the Sun Pluto opposition,
Mhm.
and the Sun is also her career,
Mhm.
and the 12th house can signify areas too of marginalized populations, so she's working with an atypical population. service capacity. And yeah, I was wondering if there are any myths that kind of speak to that aspect of Pluto.
Oh, that's such a great question. I'll need to think about that one, but I love that. I really love that question. Um,
I guess I was telling you guys earlier that before we got on, I did this deep dive into Hercules and the Hydra and that myth. And I think an abnormality in that myth would be that the Hydra continually, like whenever you cut off one of its heads, it grows two more. And that being this sort of abnormality to that is one thing I can think of. And I have Pluto conjunct my ascendant, and I can confirm that that happens. But depending on what else is going on in the person's chart, it can also, from a medical astrology perspective, indicate abnormalities in one's body, in one's, as well as, uh, feeling as though one has to be hypervigilant in one's immediate environment too.
hmm Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And
Survival.
Survival for sure. And with the strong eighth house placements too, it feels like even though I don't do the house to rulership or even the Pluto ruling Scorpio, um, there is something plutonic about the eighth house. There is something taboo. There is something, because death is something that's signified both by Pluto as well as the eighth house. I mean, there's something about her existence that in her life, she could feel like she's very close to the other side. The liminal spaces could feel very close, and that could feel very much like home to her. And that could be really hard for her to translate into how she communicates with other people. All of these Pluto underworld myths could feel very at home to a person who has Pluto conjunct their ascendant and the ruler of their ascendant in the eighth house.
Mhm. Yes, I can absolutely confirm that connection to other worlds and, just like something just out of phase would be, yeah, familiar to her. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of intensity and also just being able to see through the facades of life and that potentially being frustrating.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. Yeah, I definitely seem to get a lot of Pluto types of people that, that I work with or just that I know in general. So the underworld journeys do come up a lot. And I guess, like, when you descend into the underworld, everything gets slightly distorted and it's not normal. And I think that
Yeah.
that's the trippiness of it and why people wonder, will I go or will I not go? There's this idea that you can't go into the underworld and come back the same person. And so
Mm.
there's a bit of a resistance in that or a hesitation. But I think for people who are Pluto type people, they kind of crave that in a way. Some people might be Pluto people, but depending on their familial background or the kind of culture they grew up in, maybe that was available or not available. Some cultures, I think I think I only heard Jason Hawley say this recently. Some cultures regularly visit the underworld. If you think of even the Mexican celebration of the Day of the Dead, it's like, oh, it's not so taboo. Or different cultures that would have different celebrations around the process of death or not see it as something negative, but just see it as a part of life. Yeah. So it's interesting how Pluto people might experience Pluto depending on their background.
Yeah, I mean, any planet or archetypal signature that we'd look at from any perspective has two ways that it can go. And I've definitely experienced people who have strong Pluto placements who have a lot of fear and control and who really struggle with feeling like they need to have their hands on the control mechanisms of life because there's experiences of trauma or fear of trauma. And the way to transform that is to surrender, to bring light, to bring action and empowerment to what you fear. And I think that that's what a lot of the Pluto myths speak to. And the one that, like I said, the one that I really love is this one with Hercules and the Hydra. And the story around that is that Hercules, it's his second, what do you call it, Rachel? Second feat that he has in
His labor.
labor. Yes, thank you. And he goes to this cave or this lake. There's a whole bunch of different ways, but there's a hydra there. Every time he beats or cuts off one of its many arms, it grows two more, or arms or heads or something like that. And so part of the way that he ends up working with it is he brings in a friend, a family member, and in some of the stories, but they cut it and then immediately burn it. They bring the light to it. And so there's this idea. What I love about this myth is that as a very Plutonic person is the surrender and bringing the light and the feminine surrendering and being okay with the emotions of what's happening in these situations in life that can feel very overwhelming, and having this humbling surrender and bringing the light, the insight to that. And then that helps to make it less overwhelming and more approachable.
I mean, hearing you talk, that story makes me think about when we try to contain emotion.
Yeah.
Or some of my early meditation experiences early in life where you're trying to slow it down, not think, control your thoughts, empty your mind. And it's like more come, because you're aware
Yeah.
sudden of all of this within you and how you can't really do it. You can try to control your thoughts, control the emotions, but ultimately you have to soften into it and go through it, which
Yeah. The only way out is through.
yeah.
Very Plutonic. And so I was telling you guys that I did this. I don't use AI a lot, but I did this little AI search for this particular myth. And one of the key mantras that it came up with is, my emotions are not my enemy. They are the heads of the Hydra I am destined to illuminate, which I was like, go AI. My goodness.
Whoa.
You're becoming much more useful. This is a little scary, but there we go. And then we also have, through feeling, the warrior finds wisdom. Through surrender, power becomes love.
Wow.
Maybe we should have written in this entire podcast
AI.
through AI.
I will say that today, just in hearing the stories, as both of you shared some myth and all of your myths, Rachel, is that I had experience of the value of myth in the sense that when you were talking about the archetypes and the stories, I thought about things from my own life that just now with Lisa, that I think there is some way that the stories bring something visual. And when we're working with a symbolic language, if we can access the visual, it will open up the symbolism more in a way that we can connect with it more deeply in our own lives. So yeah, I had a little experience of myth at work.
Yeah, me too. I think I'm going to continue to play with myth and figure out how to weave it more into my life and my work. So thanks for the inspiration, Rachel. And I mean, Rachel clearly is much more knowledgeable on all of this. So if this is a type of astrological reading and insight that you're interested in experiencing, definitely reach out to her, and we'll put all of her information into the show notes for today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And just a final kind of thought on what you just said. Like, one of the things I love about myths so much is that it really does seem to speak past the conscious mind and to the subconscious mind. And what I think is so intriguing about it is that when you're actively listening to a myth, you may feel you may have certain things that'll light up in the moment, but it will stay with you longer. You may not even think that you resonated with a myth in the moment you heard it, but a few weeks later, something may happen and it may trigger the memory, or you may think of an image in the myth and you're like, whoa, this is playing out for me right now. Yeah, I've had a few of those in the past where I didn't think I really connected with the myth or the characters, and then it would keep coming up in my experience, and I would go and try to find an image of them on Google, one of the characters or one of the scenes, and I'd sit with it and I'd be like, what is that speaking to within me? What is that pulling at in my psyche? And at some point it would emerge, and I love that process. Yeah.
Yes. Feels very Neptunian in that you can't quite grasp it, yet it never goes away. Like there's some image and there's a fluidity to it where it might even change. The images of the myths might change depending on what part of it you need at the moment
Absolutely.
and could pop out and have a different form or resonance than it originally did, which I think is the magic of mythology and why I think it's such a beautiful tool.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rachel. Come back again.
Yeah,
I would.
thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time. I think in December, Sara and I will be here to tell you all about 2026. So you'll all be ready for what's in front of us for the year ahead. We'll just do a quick overview. And yeah, lots more exciting stuff coming up in the next year. So thank you, everybody, for being here as always. And thank you, Rachel. Such an honor to have you here and so great to connect after all this time. So take care. Bye, everybody. As always, thanks for listening to Broadcast Astrology, Insight for Humans. If you're so inclined, like, follow, and subscribe, and don't be a stranger.
Signing off for now. Until next time, humans, keep your gaze upwards on the stars and be well. We look forward to sharing more soon.